Okay, I've been told not to get too political on this channel because this is about science after all and not about politics. But I'm on the record anyway, participating in an anthology ridiculing Donald Trump in good fun. Link in the description. And for the rest of the video, I will be rather positive towards an idea of Donald Trump's because I don't think the Space Force is that bad an idea. So, yeah, I'm gonna go for it. Bam. There's your preview thumbnail picture. And my fun. Okay, let's do this. This video is going to be somewhat different from the others because this is not checking fiction for reality. This is developing a scenario how well a proposal for a Space Force could actually play out in reality. Basically, what we are doing here is developing our own sci-fi setting, while trying to keep it within the realms of possibility, plausibility, and logic. But I'm still trying to have fun with these, because there's a lot that can be done here. The idea of a Space Force is not actually that new. The first official announcement of a military space force was back in 1983 under President Ronald Reagan, who wanted to employ a space force to defend against the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. This was nicknamed the Star Wars program back then and was kind of an object of ridicule. It didn't get very far, but well, we did get an Air Force Space Command that's still existing, and the 14th Air Force, which is essentially the Space Force, or the closest thing we have right now. The newest advance in that direction was started by Donald Trump in June 2018 and officially announced in August by Vice President Mike Pence. And it's not as ridiculous as it sounds, as I will go on to explain. Contrary to what it sounds like, the Space Force is not that weird. The basic idea currently developed is to protect and employ satellites. And that is actually a very important mission. The armed forces of basically every Western nation and of Russia, and probably also China, is very dependent by now on the satellite network. There's a lot of services that run through it, including stuff like GPS. So yes, Pokemon Go is a very advanced military-grade technology. Anyway, a lot of stuff depends on the satellite network, its work, and the satellite network is very vulnerable to attack because the satellite can be spotted all the time from Earth. There is nothing hiding it from view because it's out there in space. It's flying in full view of basically everybody who happens to be on the right spot on Earth. So defending satellites is something that we need, especially because there have been weapons developed that do attack satellites, ground-to-space missiles and things like that. So developing a satellite defense system is not a bad idea. And that is what Space Force is primarily supposed to do. Specifically in the area of satellites, there have already been developments to militarize them. For example, Russia has a space cannon installed on one satellite. And contrary to popular belief, this is not a problem with the space treaty, because defense is legal according to this treaty as long as it's not done with unconventional weapons, so nuclear weapons and stuff like that. That is actually illegal in space. The United States alone currently has, I've been finding numbers anywhere between 500 and 1100 satellites out, and most of them are military, because you need to keep in mind NASA is also part of the Air Force. So even many civilian satellites are military. The Russians, by the way, have way more satellites, but on the other hand, for both groups and others, it's true that about 3/4 of these are dead satellites that just didn't drop from orbit yet. But still, there's a significant amount of satellites out there in space that are very vulnerable to attack. Having those under one unified command in a Space Force does make sense. Currently, these satellites are distributed all across the armed forces. There are satellites of the Navy, there are satellites of the Army, there are satellites of the Air Force, most of them. There are satellites of the intelligence services. It's a mess. So putting this under one command is not a bad idea. But that's just satellites. That's not the interesting part. Because if we get further into speculative ideas, into possibilities what could be developed within the next, say, 20 years, then it gets interesting. Then we get closer to what everybody's probably imagining when they hear of the Space Force. One particular orbital weapon where there has been a lot of speculation in the last few years and media appearances is the kinetic kill vehicle, or also known as the Rod of God, the Mjolnir system, and stuff like that. Basically, the idea is very simple. You put a heavy object about the size of a telephone booth. Look this up on Wikipedia if you don't know what a telephone booth is anymore. God, I'm old. Anyway, a rod of tungsten that size, thrown down from orbit and guided, actually has enough energy when it drops down to destroy a large target like a building or an aircraft carrier, or, well, if they're very good at aiming, maybe a tank. So the big stuff. And that is militarily very interesting to do. The only problem is how to get this tungsten rod up there and how to install a firing mechanism. Because basically you need either a rather big satellite or even a space station to launch that. But this is a system that has been conceptualized. It is a system that has not yet been tested, and testing of this is probably the first mission. It could probably be launched within, say, 5 years. The technology is not that hard to do. It's very low-tech approach to space warfare, and it has immediate uses for the armed forces. So that is probably the second phase of what the US Space Forces will do if they get installed. Another field that is also very promising would be orbital warfare. Not with soldiers out in orbit, but amongst satellites. So basically satellites shooting other satellites. Because modern armies are very dependent on infrastructure, and satellites are a very important part of infrastructure for many armies. Now, no army will be crippled without a satellite system. They do know that that's a problem, and they do have redundancies for that. But stuff like a GPS system is easy to disable, and the easiest way to do this is, of course, to destroy the GPS satellites. There's about 30 of them, or the equivalent of another nation, or other infrastructure satellites like radio structure and internet and stuff like that. So developing space weapons that go after satellites is probably something the US military will do very soon, and possibly is already researching in secret. Because, let's face it, they're just not stupid enough not to do that. That roughly covers orbit-to-orbit and orbit-to-ground warfare. But what about orbit-to-air? Because that's where it really gets interesting, but also ambitious. Introducing the ORC, Orbital Response Carrier. And yes, this is a space aircraft carrier. Now, it's been really hard to find pictures illustrating this idea, because if I look up space aircraft carriers, what I get will usually look like an aircraft carrier put in space, as in the ship put into space, and that just makes no sense at all, because they have long runways for airplanes to land on, and if you're outside of a gravity well or even just in microgravity, like in an orbit, you don't have a down anymore. And if you don't have a down, you can't use a runway. You would just bounce off that thing and drift into space with your plane. So that's a stupid design for an aircraft carrier in space. A more realistic approach would actually look like, the International Space Station with planes attached. And because the pilots and soldiers would have to stay in space for a long time to be deployable into battle at any time, we need something that simulates a gravity. So we need these big rings that rotate to simulate gravity for the soldiers. And this means this would be the biggest space station built yet. This thing is expensive. Like, really expensive. This is bigger than the ISS, and the ISS could only be built because it was a joint project of several nations. Still though, the United States has a military budget that outweighs all military budgets of all other nations combined. So, in theory, the United States might be capable of doing something. And an orbital aircraft carrier is really interesting because the function of aircraft carriers is to, carry airplanes, of course, having a mobile air base so the Air Force can be deployed from closer to the enemy. If you put your aircraft carrier into space, you can do this everywhere on the planet within hours. There are hurdles, of course, to this. We do have to have soldiers deployable up on the space station at all times. Like I said, this means we need to have living quarters. This means we have to have simulated gravity. We need to develop an orbital drop plane that can get from orbit into atmosphere and be either battle-worthy as a fighter or work as a dropship for ground troops. By the way, because the big station is called Orc, I will call these little ones the Goblin for the dropship and the Hobgoblin for the fighter. Don't know why I wanted to name these, but I just wanted to name these. We're back to the station. Having something like that is a very valuable asset to the United States. And this is very different from anything that exists today, but it might be worthwhile. And funny enough, there are civilian uses for this. Because if you have an aircraft carrier, you can use it to attack targets on Earth by quickly deploying airplanes. But this is also the perfect ship to send out colonizers to Mars or Venus or wherever. Because a mobile base like this is perfect to do that. So this might be an interesting science endeavor in addition to military. Of course, this is a major endeavor, and if this is being done, I'll expect it somewhere during the 2020s, probably closer to 2030 than anything else, if we put a lot of effort and work into this. I have to say though, I'm very disappointed that there is no working model or something like that. Nobody actually put any thought into the designs of a space aircraft carrier, and I don't have the skills yet to make a design of my own. So what I will do is I will install Blender, learn it. It has been 20 years since the last time I did anything in 3D design, back when POVRay was a thing. And once I learn it, I will get back to this topic and will do a video specifically on designing a space aircraft carrier that actually works as a space aircraft carrier, as opposed to the lazy designs that are being done in science fiction right now. Now there's one more interesting use of orbital space that comes to mind. Like I said, the space aircraft carrier would need to have simulated gravity. It does that by rotating rings, and uses the centripetal force to replace gravity. There are lots of videos explaining this concept in detail. I will just link one in the end of this video. So the interesting thing about this is we can not only simulate Earth gravity that way, but also other gravities, including higher gravity. So we can build the, hang on, I got the name written down, the Enhanced Gravity Orbital Training and Research Infrastructure Platform, short EGOTRIP. Yeah, okay, I won't do acronyms anymore. Anyway, this platform is really interesting because it has the ability to simulate gravity of Earth and higher gravity, like I said, and that is interesting for training because under higher gravity, of course, you have more weight, and this has an effect on training exercises. And when someone from a higher gravity gets into Earth gravity, it might be that he actually becomes stronger because he's adapted for much higher gravity, of course, and his muscles are freed when working with Earth gravity. Now, this is an idea I don't think has yet been tested, but it might be worthwhile to just test it, to have some troops go into high gravity, train there, come back and run some tests on their strength and endurance and so on. So the EGOTRIP platform is an interesting way to do this. It is a side mission of the carrier. It might be a preparation of the carrier, the first part of it, to be later integrated into the overall carrier, or a civilian mission in science. And you might even attach this to the ISS, as long as it's a civilian mission of research. But if this worked, we might just get the closest thing to a super soldier the United States Army can actually have. And that's a lot. That is what I think United States Space Force could achieve by about the middle of the century. And what we'll get with this is a military advantage for the United States that's basically impossible to parallel for anybody else. China and Russia might eventually also try to do an orbital aircraft carrier. They probably will succeed with this because in principle this is not that hard to do. But by that time we will have a completely revamped playing field in military missions, with deployment within hours to any place of the planet thanks to the orbital space carrier, with inter-satellite warfare trying to create a disadvantage for the enemy armies, and maybe even with soldiers trained in enhanced gravity for greater effect. The tactical changes to warfare this all would bring are tremendous. At the same time, they are so useful, I think that if the United States doesn't do it, somebody else will sooner or later. Even if it is at a smaller scale, somebody will try to do this and will gain quite the advantage from it. So it's probably not the worst idea to just try and be first. So this one took a little longer, a lot of research to do, a lot of material to collect, and something I just didn't find. Like I said, I'll be coming back to the aircraft carrier in space thing, but next time we'll tackle something that's not quite as hard to research and that I find very interesting too. We get back to biology, talking about the Venom symbiote and if it does actually work, working with the alien symbiote idea, because I don't know yet what the movie will present, if they will change this, but so far every incarnation of Venom was an alien symbiote, and there's some interesting stuff that can be said about that.